Way of doing it that they've now outlawed. You could fly a creek, you could fly. And me and some of the other anglers used to rent a little, airplane and fly the lake for an hour, hour and a half. And you could fly these creeks, and a lot of times you could see from the birds the section that was holding the bait fish. Yeah. So what you're doing now with electronics, I had other ways of trying to speed that process up. Flying it, or sometimes you had to go in there and just look for them. And then I would look for them with my depth finder too, or see them on the top at certain times of the day. But here's the reverse of that. What if the whole lake has got shad?
That is fascinating.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because that becomes a real bummer,
So one of the lakes actually that I've seen that on, it was actually just last week. I was in Lake 10 Killer in Oklahoma, and there's shad all over the entire lake. And what I've had to figure out is that on those lakes, it's so tough to get bit on lakes where there's shad everywhere. And so what I did is it completely threw off my whole process. But what I ended up finding is that when I graphed offshore, I found that there was a certain section of that lake. It was a 2-mile stretch on the main lake where these fish were getting in big schools, like 30 to 40 fish schools. And the only place I could get bit on these lakes that were full of shad were those schools that had 30 or 40 fish, because there was enough fish there to make them competitive. Yeah. I would find a lot of 1 and 2 and 5 and 10 fish schools. You couldn't get those fish to bite on other sections of the lake. But regardless, I think the most important part is that there is in my opinion, a 200-yard to 2-mile section, and there's probably 2 or 3 of them every single week of the year, where those fish are aggressive, they're actively feeding, and you can catch them very easily. If you get into another 2-mile section of a lake, or 200 yards, depending on how big your lake is, it's like you're fishing in the middle of a pond with no fish, or in the middle of a swimming pool. But then when you get into that section that has the bait, has the nutrients, and those fish are just there that week, whether it's first third of the creek, back creek, whatever, it's like you get bit every 10, 15 minutes on like everything. It doesn't really matter. And I don't think people realize that as much, because they don't look at it from a macro perspective. They try to dig in too much to say, oh, they're on wood. Well, it's probably not that they're just on wood. They're on wood in this creek or this part of the lake. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. But the one thing that now I'm interested in seeing what you've discovered, and what I'm seeing from other guys now that are really focusing on electronics like you are, in exactly positioning with more precision where the bait fish are at, is how does that affect your theories on bass migration? Used to, we've never, I don't think, have ever had a good theory on bass migration. You hear one thing, you hear another. But I'm starting to see, though, like I know when Cody Huff won Toledo Bend, these bass were following those schools long distances. Yeah. Okay, which most of us, coming from the early time frames of fishing, bass fishing, we looked at a bass as being kind of a sedimentary creature. He had a small territory and he stayed in that territory. That may have been true, but see, a bass, lakes are not a bass prime. That's not his original habitat. That's man-made. And so I think bass used to be in sloughs off from a Mississippi River, which they didn't want to go out in that river. So they stayed in there. They stayed in that little small territory. But when we made man-made impoundments, and then you had the bait source change, where back in that little slough was brim, perch, and a few occasional shad or whatever. Now in the man-made lake, they had new sources of food, and I think they've evolved, and I think that their migration is not it's much more than we think it is.
I've actually come up with some theories on this in the past. I actually made a video about this. My theory is basically the bass, they have 2 primary motivations: to reproduce, to spawn, and to feed. And I feel like the only time that a bass has a specific agenda of where it wants to be is when it's spawning. The rest of the time, it's dictated entirely on the food source. And I believe that in the video I made, I estimated 60 to 70% of the bass in a lake migrate with the bait when they're not spawning. The other 30% stay stationary where there's bluegill up shallow, where there's crawfish, and this is on a lake that maybe has bigger arms like an Ozark lake. There's threadfin shad, there's gizzard shad. It doesn't apply when you go up north. It's different because the bluegill spawn, perch, or the big forage. There's a lot of stuff I can get into on this, but I guess my thought process is that those bass, they're going to follow where the bait fish are, and I believe those bait fish, they are trying to evade the bass, and their primary motivation is to reproduce as well. So usually the shad will spawn 2 weeks after a bass will, and then after they spawn, they want to get to the deepest water they can possible because they can hide from the bass and get away from them in the middle of the creeks, out in the creek channels, because if those bass try to chase them, they have much more room to escape.
I agree with everything you said, except I don't think they're even aware of the bass.
Really? You don't think so?
I don't even think they know they're there.
Really? So it's not like a symbiotic...
It's like a meteorite hits this planet, you know, we don't even know it was there.
Really? See, I always thought they would be aware of them. That's, I didn't even think about that.
No, I think you're dead right. All they're considered is finding plankton and eating it. And, you know, they're with a million other shad trying to eat the same plankton. Yeah. I think their total focus is just trying to get that, you know, eat whatever that food source is they're eating. And do you mean, am I saying that when the bass comes up there and blows through them that they're aware of it, but they have no clue what it is? They don't even know the ones around and died.
So they're just kind of...
Yeah, you know, they're just, but I say that, and I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but if you'll watch how they move, okay, they move in such a unison that you don't think they ever bump into themselves, and I know they do. They have to bump into themselves occasionally because you got a million of them doing this unison, okay? Just because a bass comes out here to the outer layer of them, yeah, these outside ones know there's just the water pressure alone, there's something coming to them, but it's no more than a heavy current, you know, or some movement, water displacement coming at them. They don't know what it is until it hits them, and then it's too late. But all the other ones, because this one's moving, it's moving with them. Yeah. He's moving with them. He's moving with them. And so it looks like the whole school is trying to elude. I just don't think they have that awareness ability.
So really, they're just after that food source.
Yeah, they're not. Them bass are not going to run them off that food source. You know. Yeah, they may eventually consume them all, like tuna in the ocean. If you get a tuna and birds on top and tuna underneath and sharks and porpoises, eventually they may decimate the whole sardine school. You got the humpback whales eating them, but it doesn't deter. They're going to come back there next year. They know if they knew that their predator was there, would they come back next year? I don't know. No, it's just. I think again, it's the main thing is that both of them are governed by the same thing. The only reason they're there is for food.
So I guess my question then would be on that, why would you think that the bait fish move out towards the deeper part of the lake in the summer as opposed to staying shallower? Because I feel like there is plenty of plankton and food for them up shallow or in the middle of the creeks rather than being out in the middle of the lake.
There's not enough room.
Not enough room for them?
You got a biomass situation going on. And I mean, when they, like you said, it can get to the point where 10 killer. Yeah. Where I mean, they're just overcrowded. They're, you know, and the nutrients are everywhere, but eventually they're going to exceed the biomass.
Gotcha.
You know, and that's more of a biological question. Because here's another mystery I don't understand, and we're talking threadfin shad here. Is why do they then move back into the creeks in the fall?
I think it's because of the lake turnover with the thermocline, because on those deeper parts of the lake, you have that low oxygen water that's hanging low. Yeah. When it mixes, I think there's so much, in that deeper water, there's so much, like let's say only 30% of the water has oxygen, 70% doesn't. It mixes and it makes that water so bad for those bait fish, they have to go shallower.
And that to me is the answer to your other question, why do they move out?
For the thermocline then.
They move out. Because we all know shad and bait fish are more fragile. Bass is not very fragile. Yeah. He's a redneck. it takes a lot of low oxygen and heat.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
They'll be anywhere.
Yeah, they'll be anywhere for foods but the shad can't do that.
Yeah.
The shad have certain oxygen requirements and certain temperature requirements, you know, or it's just not good for them. I mean, so I think that's why they move out to begin with, is to meet those requirements. And I'm just like the Native American guy at Survival told me. He said, Rick, you've done it backwards your whole career. You've been studying the owl, and you should have been studying the mouse. And he's right. I don't still understand this mouse, the shad, the way I should. If I had to do it over, I would reverse that. I'd study the shad, the brim, the crawfish, but because that's the whole key. And like I said, me and you, I'm sitting here guessing at why these shad are doing this and doing that. And sometimes they disappear completely. Yep. Now, not to you anymore, but to me, they completely disappear. You don't see the birds, you don't see the activity on top, you know. You don't see those things that a shallow water fisherman always used to figure out if they were there.
You know, like on table rock, we go 70 feet deep sometimes because the oxygen's good enough down there, and I catch them on a floater slab spoon in 70 foot of water.
Do you ever lose them completely?
No, I don't. Well, in certain sections of the lake, it's interesting because there's certain sections of the lake or areas of a lake where those shad will be really thick in the summer, and then they move in the creeks in the fall, and then back in the winter, it's like they're gone. I don't know where they go. But then I find them again in a different section of that lake. And so I'm never focused on one. I never go to the lake and say, I'm going to fish this creek or that creek. I go to the lake to determine where is the food source. And sometimes I might graph, like for example, on the lower end of Beaver Lake this year, I went and graphed for 4 miles of that lake and found no bait fish, no shad. I couldn't find them at all. And that actually triggered something in my head to say, okay, I just graphed, sorry?
What month was that?
It was in March or late February. And there was no bait fish in the backs of the creeks. I mean, I spent 6 hours graphing, and I realized I just graphed 4 miles of this lake. There's not 0 bass living here. So I think, okay, what's the other food source for these bass? It has to be brim, crawfish. So I immediately then, instead of trying to go find them offshore, I went, picked up a rock crawler, spur rock crawler, started fishing on the bank, and I was just crushing them. Fishing rock transitions with a rock crawler, and they were spitting up crawfish down their pincers, pooping them out. I mean, it's crazy. And I'm just thinking, okay, well, if there's no other food source there, they have to be feeding on crawfish, and it took me no time at all to find them because that was all they had to eat. And so I think that's how I've always gone about it, is if I can't find bait, threadfin shad, gizzard shad, I then look for either crawfish or bluegill, and that's really for me more of a shallow water situation then, where I'll basically abandon offshore if I don't see a good gizzard shad threadfin population, because then I can't follow the fish as well. It's easier for me to just go to your approach then with crawfish, bluegill. That's at least how I've done it.
No, it just shows you again, like maybe you still got a chance. I'm not sure I can study the mouse long enough now to realize, you know, exactly what it does and where it's at, and it's again, there's just so much we don't know, because I think a crawfish and you know, life and living creatures depend on nutrients of different types, and we know that a crawfish is, I mean, I have to believe that a crawfish is providing necessary nutrients to the bass that a shad can't. Mm-hmm. You know, and there's times the opposite may be true. You know, that it needs that type of nutrient that a shad has, an abundance of it, for whatever reasons, you know.
Well, you can't graph for crawfish. You can graph for bluegill, find bluegill beds and stuff offshore, but most of the time it's visually looking for bluegill. So with the bluegill, a lot of times of the year, and the crawfish, you can't use electronics for that. And so that's another thing I really want to start looking into, is how do you start determining where the crawfish are based on what the bottom composition looks like on the graph, things like that, because that's a whole nother level you could take it to say, I'm going to target those bass that are off the threadfin shad or off the gizzard shad. And that's what they do a lot on the lakes over in South Carolina, like Hartwell and Clark's Hill, where they have the herring. Blueback. The bluebacks, they focus so much on those bluebacks that a lot of guys will go back in the backs of the creeks, way back in the creeks, and get away from any bluebacks and focus on brim beds and like brim feeding bass, because it detaches them from that feeding cycle.
Well, you're back in more of the natural largemouth bass behavior, and I did the same thing at Clarkdale. I didn't want to go out there and chase these largemouth bass that thought they were stripers, because that was a different behavior, a behavior that I'm not familiar with. Yep. And so I did the same thing. I'd go as far back in the creeks as I could to get back with largemouth bass that were acting like largemouth bass.
And I think that there's a untapped element there where people, or I think some tournament angler, hopefully maybe I'll figure it out, I won't be on the tournament trail, but I think someone who's going to figure out how to use the electronics then to target those bass that are feeding on crawfish and bluegill, and that's a whole new realm of fishing in my mind.
Yeah, and it definitely is, you know, because the crawfish science is not very much there unless you're a Cajun down in raising crawfish. How deep will they go in the lakes? I know Stacy King at Table Rock sets crawfish traps 30 feet down and catches these big, giant crawfish. Really? Yeah. This creek right here by my house has crawfish bigger than any Cajun crawfish I've ever seen. So, and I think that when I did start studying crawfish, every state has 7, 8, 9. There's like scores of different species of crawfish. Really? So so, you know, it's just, and I think if I had to say what is the dominant food for bass, it's crawfish. Yeah. But I started to say something which is a mistake. I started to say because I see more of that in my live well than I do shad or brim. But that's because they don't digest the crawfish as quickly as they digest the shad or the brim.
Now, I personally, and this is just our personal thoughts and theories, is I think that the bait fish, the threadfin shad, the gizzard shad, dictate bass movement more than the crawfish do. I believe a lot of times that the bass are following the schools of bait fish, and then the crawfish happen to be there as a result, or it's the last resort. And so I think that for me, I always find that on lakes that have the threadfin shad, the gizzard shad, finding bass is so much more simple with electronics, because that is what dictates their movement, their positioning. And up north, I'm always looking for brim beds and perch beds, because in the summertime when you can actually fish, like up in Wisconsin where I grew up, the primary forage on a lot of those fisheries, especially the grassy or like bowl type lakes like a Cayuga, stuff like that, is a lot of brim that will spawn throughout the entire summer. And you know, some lakes there's alewife and there's other forage, golden shiners, but a lot of times up north in the grass lakes, it's all about finding where those holes in the grass are, where those brim are setting up, either staging to spawn, spawning, or post-spawn. And I get those two things. You can find those on your fish finder very easily, both the threadfin shad, gizzard shad, and bluegill. Crawfish, that's a whole, you can't find them. But there is a group of bass that probably is feeding on crawfish a good percentage of the year, maybe more percentage of the year than we even know.
Well, if you watching migratory animals in Africa and some of the elephants and stuff, because they migrate over huge areas and they know where to be at a certain time. There's a certain amount of food historically presents itself. And so with bass and crawfish, I think bass know that. They know when to be when these crawfish are going to be most abundant. And they know those areas, and they know when to be there. It's genetic or whatever you want to call it. But brim, to me, their behavior is the only one I will try to act like I understand. It's because I think they're like a bass. I think they use the same types of habitat. They will go just as deep. I mean, you catch them on a jig and spoon in 30, 40 foot of water, I know, in Table Rock, but they're usually around brush or broken rock of some type, just like a bass would be. You don't catch them roaming around out there on the sandy beach, 25, 30 foot deep very often. You know, so I'm embarrassed that we have this conversation, because I'm going to demonstrate how little I know about the number one thing that controls the fish I've fished for my whole life.
Well, I don't think anyone knows. That's the fascinating thing about, I think, the potential of us working together is we can put our heads together, maybe bring in other anglers as well and try to figure this out. Because I think there is, it's so fascinating. I think, like you said, we've had it wrong this whole time, potentially. Everyone's focused on what does a bass do, but it's about what it's eating.
Yeah, and like you said, I have a lot more to gain than you do, because I know I'm going to try what you're doing. I don't know if you're going to get on that bank and beat it to death like I do.
Here's what to look forward to on the next episode.
Well, one other thing I wanted to talk about that we didn't touch on was how to find those bigger fish areas. So I know you said like on Toledo Bend, there's areas where you have the mixture of both, but I know some lakes, there's certain sections that just have those bigger fish, and if you just go there and set up, you can catch them. One great example is like Grand Lake, where Edwin Evers, he went up that Elk River, and he knew that there were 6, 7, 8 pounders living up that river, and he was able to go catch a 28-pound bag the last day of the Classic, win the tournament. And he knew they were there, but he didn't go fish them every day. He went and fished 3 different sections of the lake. And I just want to understand, like, how do you go about knowing that there's big fish there, especially if they only have such a small bite window that you maybe only have them show themselves on a lure 1 hour